So one of the things that we frequently see is kids getting stuck. And well, quite frankly, it's not just kids, it's adults too. People get stuck all over the place. And can you go to the next slide, Tiffany? You know, and we want to talk a little bit about why that is, why that happens, and what you can do about it. So that's what we're aiming for. If we've done a good job of this, you'll have some sense at the end of why it happens and what you can do about it. And so people get stuck on all kinds of things. It gets stuck on things that you do. And I think we frequently see this with video games, and we get stuck on things that they don't do. Yeah, Tiffany? No, you've got your hand up, it looks like. Okay, sorry. You get stuck on things that they don't do, things like homework, that kind of thing. Get stuck on thoughts, get stuck on feelings, get stuck on all kinds of things. So if you ever watch, you know, sometimes you see somebody walking down the sidewalk and you'll see them having a conversation with themselves, and they're pretty animated, even though there's nobody around and they're not talking to anybody. Well, they're probably stuck on thoughts, probably stuck on feelings as well. And so I think we got a couple of examples, don't we, of our kids getting stuck on things?
I had an example of a grown-up, specifically myself, getting stuck on things that I think a number of you could probably relate to, which is that during the first part of quarantine, I decided it was a great idea to download the TikTok app because my kids talked about it all the time. And no, it wasn't a good idea at all. And for those of you that are listening that have not downloaded the TikTok app, don't do it. Don't do it, because it's so easy to get stuck in TikTok. You know, if you're finishing one task and you have like 3 minutes to do, you know, before your next meeting or whatever, I could unload the dishwasher, I could do that, or I could scroll through TikTok for that 3 minutes. And it's so hard to get off of it because what's another 45 seconds if I go to the next one and the next one? So that's an example of, you know, a grown-up getting stuck on something that they're doing. And we see this all the time with kids, right? The biggest thing that kids get stuck on these days, I think, is technology as well, right? Video games, whatever kind of screen they're on. It can be really hard to get them off. And I think that's where we see a lot of the meltdowns, the big explosions is when we're trying to get a kid to transition from something that they prefer to something they don't prefer. So this is kind of a big one for most people.
Can we get the next slide, Tiffany? All right, so we're going to talk about different kinds of cycles today. And so first we'll talk about the good one. And these are sort of mirror images of each other. So the cycle, and we'll call this one a virtuous cycle, is made up of a bunch of different components. There's a skill. And so there's a certain level of skill to start. There are positive beliefs about something. There's a positive emotion attached to that thing. And people tend to do the thing. Now, approach means to do something. You're approaching it, you're taking part in it. And I think Tiffany's got an example for us here about a virtuous cycle that she's seen her child in. And you'll recognize this in the kids that you, in your own kids and the kids that you work with.
So we started piano lessons with my daughter when she was in grade 2. And by that point, she had played around with music a lot. And so she had some skill with rhythm and knowing music and singing along. And she believed herself to be musical and had heard that from the daycare and from teachers that she did well in music. So we started the lessons. And what I found is that she felt good playing the music. She liked it. She liked practicing. And in fact, I used to shush the teacher who would talk about how you had to bribe your kids to practice, because my daughter would walk into our living room where the keyboard was and just start playing. And because she was practicing, she would get better at it, and she enjoyed it, and she got praise for it. And it was literally a cycle of improvement and enjoyment. And so that is not how my son went through piano, just so you know, but my daughter had a very positive piano experience.
So then again, if you look at the elements of that, there's some skill to start and positive beliefs and enjoyment. And then as you do it, you get better, you improve your skill, and these things just feed on themselves, and you get better and better and better. Okay. Now let's talk about the flip side of that. So here I can probably actually give you an example of my daughter in piano. Um, so the vicious cycle has exactly the same components to it. Okay, so there's a lack of skill or a perceived lack of skill. There's a negative belief about this thing. So the negative beliefs that we hear most frequently are, this is stupid. I'll never do this again. I don't like this. I can't do this. These are all kinds of, examples of negative beliefs that happen. There's a negative emotion attached to it. It's boring. It's hard. It's frustrating. It's, there's some sort of negative emotion. And then there is avoidance. So because I don't like it, I don't do it. And so what we see over time on that is as you avoid, you don't improve your skill. You fall further and further behind your peers on whatever task it is that you're doing. And you believe that you can't do it. And sometimes for good reason, because you haven't practiced, you're not good at it. And so this is, again, a cycle that feeds on itself and goes in the opposite direction of what we want. And this is, quite frankly, exactly what I saw with my daughters in piano lessons, to be perfectly honest. Or actually, what's interesting about it is they didn't start with a lack of skill. But one element of this, and that was negative emotion, I do not want to do this, totally kiboshed their willingness to do piano. So negative emotion led to avoidance. And over time, that did lead to lack of skill. They fell behind the other kids in their class, and they came to believe that they weren't very good at it. Okay, so exactly the same task for Tiffany's kids led to a virtuous cycle, or for her daughter, and for my daughters, it led to a vicious cycle. Okay, and so this is where we frequently find ourselves, is when a child is struggling, they are stuck in a vicious cycle somewhere. Oh, okay. That's too bad, that's too bad, Catherine. I don't know if anybody else is experiencing that. Please let us know if you are.
Oh, okay. It's coming through on my end fine. Does your sound okay? Yeah. Okay.
It's getting it cutting in a little bit in and out, but sustaining. I'm not seeing the chat though when you just said that. Sorry.
Oh, okay. It looks like most people are hearing it okay. Okay.
I think I guess the three of us need to keep one mic on at a time, probably, right? Yeah, that may be part of it.
Okay.
Okay.
I have a quick example here as well, Dave, that I'll just chime in on. And I think this one is interesting because vicious cycles and virtuous cycles can exist in the same person at the same time. And that actually often leads to some complexity. And I'm thinking in particular of a young girl I worked with a couple of years ago who was really good at a lot of things. For example, she was a grade 3 student and she loved working with the kindies, and she was really good at it, and they just loved her. And she had a whole bunch of things, whole bunch of virtuous cycles going on. But she, in part because of that, she became a little bit of a perfectionist because she saw herself as good at so many things. One thing she wasn't so good at was writing. So whenever she would come up against a writing task, she would, say, I can't do this. I'm terrible at this. I suck at this. This is stupid. She would flood with negative emotions. So she would start to cry. Sometimes she would throw things. And then ultimately she would refuse to do the writing task. And so that just, it was an interesting case to see that, she had all these virtuous cycles going on that were fantastic, but it was this one vicious cycle that was really, really interrupting her functioning at school, because of course you have to write at school a lot. And now that I'm hearing myself talk, I'm thinking a really neat intervention there would have been to somehow use the skill with working with younger kids to help her with the writing, like maybe having her teach them or something. I should have thought of that at the time, but I didn't. So, but that's just an example of those things co-occurring.
And I think, thanks, Laura. And I think we've done parts of this in a different presentation, and we had somebody else with us at the time. And she had a great example of her daughter being in a vicious cycle with regard to reading, but in a virtuous cycle with regard to art. And what they did over time was they actually melded the two. They actually used the virtuous cycle, and they got her to sort of understand how skill is developed. And they applied art as much as they could to reading. And it turned, and they managed to turn a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. And it was not instantaneous. This took time. This took a lot of effort. It took a lot of planning. But one of the things that's really important about this, and I'm going to speak to my fellow presenters here for a second. I think we're going to have to ditch a lot of our slides. One thing that's really important about this is that if you are able to identify the elements of the vicious cycle, it helps you plan where you want to intervene. Okay, so if you think about this for a second, we have 4 elements of a vicious cycle. That means we can intervene at any one of those 4 points. So if we change their skill, maybe the vicious cycle turns. If we change their beliefs, maybe the vicious cycle turns. If we change the emotion or help them cope with it, maybe the vicious cycle turns. If we can move from avoidance to approach, maybe maybe we can turn the cycle around. And so what's really important here is understanding these different elements, identifying them within your own child, and then saying, okay, so I can help the skill this way, I can help the belief this way, I can help the emotion this way, and then, you know, maybe I can help, or maybe I can just get them to try it, and we'll get it going that way. So you've got 4 different points. Most of the time, people intervene at the point of avoidance, most of the time. So when a child isn't doing something, we try to force them to do it. And that's not necessarily a bad intervention, but it's not necessarily going to work either. If it works, it's by far the simplest one out of all of these to do. Okay, so if we can get them to do something instead of not do it, that's by far the simplest way to approach this. Great if it works. But if it doesn't, we're not stuck. Okay. Anything to add, you guys? No? Okay. From our other slides, and I'm just aware of the time, from our other slides, I think you know, we're talking here about the elements that are sort of internal to the child. From the other slides, the thing that matters is that what's internal isn't the only thing that keeps a vicious cycle going. Okay, so yeah, I'd skip that one. There are also environmental reasons. So there are things outside the child that impact a vicious cycle and perpetuate it. Can we have the next slide, Tiffany? Okay, so one of the things that is really important when it comes to altering a vicious cycle is to look at the social connection of the child. Look at the connection of the child to the people around them, okay? Social connection is important for a whole bunch of reasons. And again, if we think about the internal reasons, it's easier to impact someone else when you have a good social connection with them. It's easier to help them change the way they think. It's easier to help them feel better, okay? If we look at outcomes, if we look at what happens as a result of what I'm trying to do. So if we think about somebody who struggles with writing, the outcome's right there in front of you every time you try to write. I tried it, it didn't work, okay? And so that becomes really, really difficult. So changing outcomes and changing perceptions of outcomes, looking at what does success actually mean. Frequently that requires another person. Frequently that requires somebody outside yourself to help you understand, okay, you know, I can understand writing success as looking the same as everybody else in my class, or I can understand it as being a little bit better than I was yesterday, okay? And attempting to alter understanding of outcomes is often something that comes from outside, okay? And yeah, Tiffany.
I just had an interesting thing happen with a student I was working with this week, actually, who was commenting on a writing task she had to do in the morning. And she had brought it with us to start doing while I got set up. And I didn't know what the content of what she was writing was, but she was using, they always try to use all the pages, right? So they'd use the right-hand side of this book, and now they were going back through on the left-hand side. And so she was printing on the page across from something she had written in October. And from across the table, I could see that she was writing more, that she was writing more legibly and that it fit more on the page, like on the lines. And so I actually commented on that. I didn't know her well, but I just said, wow, like that was from October. Look how much you've grown in your writing. I wasn't thinking about cycles or anything, but it was just that moment where she stopped sitting and she actually smiled under her mask because her eyes smiled. But it was notable because we don't often do that. You don't often have an opportunity to very clearly see, I used to do it this way and now I can do it this way, right? Which is something that is so powerful, right? That inside yourself changes.
Thanks, Tiffany. And that kind of external push can help, is one of the things that can help change. Yeah, look at that. I am doing better than I was before. And suddenly it starts to alter the beliefs, and it also alters the feelings. And we see that when the child smiles, it's like, hey, all right, we got somewhere, that's good. And it may be brief, but at least it was there, okay? One of the other things that perpetuates cycles is adult belief. And this is one where everybody needs to check themselves, okay? So frequently when we'll go into schools and, you know, we talk to parents, whatever the case may be, they have set beliefs about what a child is able to do and not able to do, okay? And I remember this. I remember this going back to my kids going into kindergarten. And I wanted my kids to be very close to reading when they went into kindergarten. And there were a couple of good reasons for that. One reason was I want them to define themselves as smart, and I want the teachers to define them as smart. Because when somebody believes in a child, there's a tendency for a self-fulfilling prophecy, okay? And that's also true for when they don't believe in the child, okay? So adult beliefs are something that help perpetuate these kinds of cycles, both the vicious and the virtuous, right? If you look at a child and say, well, I really think you're going to get this, or you're right on the verge, I believe you can do this, that helps them move. That helps them move in the direction we want. If we look at a child and say, oh, you're never going to get this, then the chances of them doing it are much, much, much less. Okay, so those are some of the things that we as adults need to watch. Okay, so forming good connections, helping understand outcomes in a helpful way, and watching our own beliefs. Those are some of the kinds of things that are external to this cycle, but that's still impacted. Okay. Co-presenters, anything to add?
I did have one thought when you were going through that about adult belief, because it isn't even necessarily that you don't believe they can do it, but it can be, I've seen that you get really upset when you do this, so we're just not going to do it. So by encouraging or enabling the avoidance, right, to try to help your child not feel distress, which I understand and is very natural to do, actually feeds into the vicious cycle, because the message you're giving is then you aren't going to get it, whether you're saying because it's you don't want them upset, they may interpret it as you agree with me that I can never do this, right? So it's that looking at it from all the sides.
Thanks, Tiffany. Okay, so the what do you do? This is going to be repetition in some ways of what we've already covered, right? So think about the 4 elements, right? Skill, belief, emotion, and approach or avoidance behavior. Okay, so what do? You pick one of those, and actually frequently you pick all of them, and you target, what am I going to do? How am I going to increase skill? How am I going to change belief? How am I going to help with emotion? And how am I going to help approach? So sit down, think about it, plan, what am I going to do? Beyond that, then you look back at my part and other adults in the environment. What's their part? What are their beliefs about the child? How are the social connections? How are we understanding outcomes? And do we need to shift that? So those are really the elements. So what do? You take all of those parts, you think about them, and then you put them together into an intervention that hopefully starts to turn a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. Okay. At this point, again, you guys, anything else to add? No. Okay. So I think at this point, we'll stop recording, right? And open it up to questions.